Thank you, Carol, for the invitation to speak tonight. It's great to be here. I'm honored to be able to present at this fantastic museum, which is an invaluable organization in New York City, and especially to be here with Justin. And I really appreciate the opportunity to bring to life, so to speak, the essay I co-authored with Guy Nordenson for the fantastic collection of essays that Carol just mentioned, celebrating the 60th anniversary of the landmarks legislation. And thanks, obviously, to Barbara Lee as well, as always, for bringing amazing people together and basically letting us do our stuff. A bit about Guy and I for a moment, because I think it speaks to the broader themes of our piece and the ways in which the best engineering often emerges from a robust dialogue among engineers in the gray area that exists within our profession. A take that likely runs counter to the way most people think of our profession. We think of engineers as being seen as rigorous and rigid and adverse to change, but that's not the way Guy and I have known each other over the past 40 years. And although we've never worked in the same office, we've collaborated on several projects, including the National History Museum for African American History and Culture on the Mall in Washington, D.C., and more importantly, have maintained a very close personal and professional friendship. We both teach and practice and are, in the end, generalists who have done most everything in the profession over our careers. Although the balance of our experiences differs somewhat. Work on new buildings versus work on existing buildings, volume of project work relative to time in academia, relationships built around builders and craftspeople relative to work on code committees. We've done it all, but at a different balance. Our deep trust and respect, though, coupled with these at times divergent perspectives, have often prompted wonderful conversations, even debates at times, around structures, both new and old, and our place as engineers in the world, where we sometimes lead the project discourse and other times, as a consultant, are simply players within an architect's vision. So it was a joy to write this essay together, one of the few project types we had not collaborated on before. And that joy in collaborating and sharing in an otherwise too competitive industry is what often animates us. How do we better leverage robust debate and dialogue among a group of engineers who might compete in business, but who share a general trust and respect? And could that dialogue and debate serve our industry and the ambivalence, contradictions, and churn that embodies historic structures in the same way that the Preservation Commission has served landmarks for the past 60 years? But I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's begin at the end of the essay. David Hammond's Days Ends, which, by the way, was designed largely by Guy and Adam Weinberg based on a sketch by Hammond's, which clearly evokes the ghostly silhouettes that are the spirit within our buildings. The structural systems and assemblies once thought strong and new and now no longer considered thus, but still intact and working. What role should these skeletal ghosts play over the next 60 years as codes evolve? Who judges what's worth saving? When a building code ceases to recognize a structural assembly as appropriate, does it cease to have value? Do the buildings that system supports suddenly cease to be safe? Certainly there are moments where the historical, architectural, and structural all merit recognition, where the structural advancement is integrated into the architecture and the moment is clearly recognized for both. Most obviously, this has occurred in Chicago, where many of the buildings that are considered landmarks are very clearly part of the Chicago frame period, and therefore born out of a structural approach to tower design, buttressed and enhanced by designers like Mies and SOM. And in New York, there are clearly buildings that speak to their structure, the Seagram's building, the Soho Cast Iron District, and several others. But the truth is not as direct as with the Chicago tower buildings, and the designation that recognizes these buildings are often not made based on structural advancement or movement of the time.
These are architectural designs that happen to celebrate structure, and there's a difference. And they celebrate as a player in the performance, but the award and the designation goes to the lead, which is architecture, and not to the cast, or in some cases, the cast iron. In fact, couldn't resist, sorry. In many instances, codes in the engineering industry, frankly, thread over the structure within many designated buildings. And some engineers foment for change and upgrade. Some fomenting enough to suggest that damage to historic fabric is worth the technological advancement, while others argue that the inherent strength of the archaic structures and the obvious fact that it has withstood decades of use without issue. Those pitched in battle often take one side or the other, but what if there was more voices in the room and a dialogue around these issues than others? Does time history of a structure erode the inherent strength, or has maintenance maintained it? Is the technology to upgrade appropriate and compatible, or will it do more damage than good? And more on that in a bit. There's ambiguity and no clear path, building to building, project to project. There are moments, very obvious moments, of exposed structural bravado we recognize. And we certainly celebrate the aesthetic of the elegance of the Guastavino vaulting, and numerous landmarks have Guastavino vaults within them. But we rarely designate a building based purely on the vaults. And there are examples over the past 60 years where these vaults have simply been demolished because they were in the way of progress. And why is it not thus? Why is it that we're not celebrating, after 60 years of law, the designation of all Guastavino vaults or all terracotta flat arch floors? Is there a moment where the technological advancements of Homer Balcom, Fred Severud, or Leslie Robinson, to name a few pioneers in engineering in New York, are all recognized by landmarks or a sub-landmarks commission of structural engineers? Or try for a second a relatively dark thought experiment. Why is it that no one, upon reimagining Ground Zero after 9/11, remarked on the unique structural approach of the World Trade Center as a rationale for rebuilding in kind? Perhaps that sounds absurd, but as we note in our essay, if horrible as it is to imagine 9/11 targeted the Statue of Liberty, it's fairly certain that it would have been rebuilt in kind. So to be clear, I'm not actually arguing that we landmark hundreds of hidden structures around New York, or suggest that just because something represents a technological advancement 100 years ago, it means it's appropriate now. But how does one adjudicate? How does one find merit, to use the key word in the original landmarks legislation? And before you say that the merit is simply in the strength of the structure and its appropriateness, and that we're all engineers and we can just decide, let's keep going and play this out just a bit more. There are large swaths of specific structural assemblies that are often not within designated buildings, but that make up a significant part of this city's fabric and have proven themselves to be especially enduring, whether originally intended or not. One example being the pre-war apartment buildings that line the north-south canyons to either side of Central Park, and whose floors are most often either terracotta flat arch or cinder slab. Both remarkably durable and strong as an assembly, but brittle and low strength by modern standards. In addition, almost all of these buildings have completely irregular column grids, with little to no ability to frankly support wind loads in a modern sense, let alone a seismic event. Before 1968, you did not have to build any building and design any building in New York for wind. Of course, architecture was prioritized, and this non-grid layout, ubiquitous in today's concrete residential buildings as well, allowed for the glory of the Classic Six. A second example is the iconic buildings of the late 19th and 20th centuries, made up of thick, unreinforced masonry walls and mass timber, and often, by the way, placed directly in flood zones. These structures have shown a resilience that few other historic assemblies have shown, and a remarkable ability to adapt to a variety of uses over the years, and Justin speaks about this in his essay. Almost a perfect blank canvas for storage, residential, office, retail, on and on and on, which in this age where we now understand the critical nature of embodied carbon as part of the sustainability story is an incredible attribute. But ask a structural engineer who is on a code committee writing code language through the lens of new construction, or has never been inside an old factory or seen the durable strength of terracotta flat arch floor, whether these structures should ultimately be let to stand without reinforcing in 2025, and most will tell you that clay tile floors, cinder slabs, and unreinforced masonry are all too brittle, and in the case of the walls, often too heavy to be effective in a seismic zone, and that the lateral system is indeterminate and might fail in an extreme event. So what do? You are left with an infinite number of structures that exist to this day and are accepted in this way by industry, by building officials, and by the public, mainly because reinforcing them all is a complete impossibility, but also because they do have strength. It's simply no longer codified or clearly recognized in modern codes. In search of an answer to this tension, building officials have worked over the past 20 or so years to put into motion triggers that essentially force owners to upgrade the structural assemblies within existing buildings to meet modern code requirements based on the level of renovation one is planning to do. If you're gutting a building or changing its occupancy or taking out significant portions, you must upgrade. That's not an unreasonable approach, and it's generally worked well. But even then, ambiguity, contradiction, and the like. Building codes, respecting the idea that the fabric of a landmark building is of value, often have a specific exception for registered historic buildings, meaning that the code is strict about the need to retrofit for the public safety and yet allows a pass in a historically relevant building, which are often still occupied and used. Does that make the building unsafe? Not necessarily, but this has always felt like a very clunky approach to a more nuanced challenge. And what of larger institutions and buildings that go through multiple generations of renovation and adaptation over their lifetime? Perhaps never crossing that threshold to require upgrade, but in many instances, losing the assumed inherent strength of the whole, sometimes a brick or a stone at a time. The Metropolitan Museum of Art, I lost that slide, highlighted within our essay, has taken a journey through hundreds of small, medium, and large renovations, additions, and revisions, none of which ultimately required a wholesale upgrade, and many of which likely did not require the engineer to design to modern code level. The Met being a particularly rich tapestry of architectural and structural moments in time, often clearly indicated throughout. The question we ask is not whether old structures should simply be allowed to remain untouched because they perform for a long time, and therefore they'll just keep performing. The question is, are there specific unique structural systems that can be deemed both unique and safe and worth preserving, regardless of what the code says relative to the proposed work going on around the structure? And in asking that question, we ask that people both recognize that these already exist all around us and that fixing them all at the same time, again, is an impossibility. Okay, so let's say we're not going to landmark the infinite number of row houses, candela apartments, warehouses, and archaic structural systems in general. Do we turn to a different lens and suggest the landmarking of a one-off structure or unique structures at the very least? Oh, there's my Met Museum. A great example for consideration might be the library stack system developed by Agnes Steed MacDonald and quietly pervasive in a significant number of landmark structures such as the New York Historic Society and the Frick Library. This collection, this is a sweetly elegant system, a multi-floor system of shelving that supports each remarkably thin floor on the shelving itself, typically inserted with a large multi-floor opening in a more conventional building. The thinness of the floors allowing for floors to misalign with the base building, resulting effectively in a solid stack of books many stories high. And this is the New York Historic Society with that stack system in the rear. This is also a super efficient system whose elements were not able to be defined in a refined way whose elements were able to be defined in a refined way because books don't go anywhere and you know how much load there is all the time. These systems would likely not be deemed structurally capable in an earthquake. Another example is the stone stairs at the City Hall in the Museum of New York, floating off of one wall, appearing to cantilever, but really an integrated series of stone, one relying seamlessly on the next, cascading downward. Obviously durable, resilient, and safe, but virtually impossible to quantify rigorously by modern standards. Times change, and Landmarks Commission's works hard to recognize that. New York City is churn. As we note in the first words of the essay, quote, for Rem Koolhaus in his aptly named Delirious New York, the concept of landmark is complex. Structures from the Brooklyn Bridge to the Chrysler Tower and Empire State Building endure, but they are increasingly hemmed in by newer upstarts. Structures and structural systems are no different. Unmentioned so far, but all around us this evening, is the evolution of the Tower of New York. The old towers that signify gravitas and authority, clad in brick and stone and filled with cavernous corridors and more brick and stone, to towers of glass that are intended to connote future and soared next to their brooding neighbors. And in that evolution, cycles of advancement in structural engineering produced even more limber buildings to the point of the current super talls along Central Park South, where the movements are not felt thanks to dampers, but the light gypsum partitions still crack due to the amount of movement. Often codes push one generation out of the way and regulate through the lens that new is deemed better. Yes, this structure was safe for 80 years, but from this point forward, it is no longer considered safe. And yet these buildings remain and thrive, and code officials wink and nod and carry on until an owner does some significant amount of work, and then the curtain often falls. But advancement doesn't always pan out. The industry is starting to see that steel interventions into unreinforced masonry buildings of the past 20 or 30 years or so may not be the right solution. That there may be new ways and new technologies to better understand the behavior of these structures during an earthquake. And this new research is already leading to significantly more refined interventions, ambivalence, contradiction, churn. So just as Landmarks leaves the designating to a group of people selected for their expertise and raises the matter to a level of public discourse, one could imagine, over the coming 60 years, perhaps a commission of structural engineers, a diverse group who are expert in analysis, archaic structural systems, experimentation, and construction being impaneled to opine on whether certain systems could be retained through a major renovation, rather than reinforced, buttress, or demolished. These decisions based not only on the value of the system as a heritage item, but the inherent strengths as well that may not be properly recognized by modern code. The relative risk to safety and other factors that a cold reading of code often leaves out. And if that sounds overwrought or something that would lead to unsafe structures or over-romanticizing a historic fabric, consider that this happens all the time as we speak. Engineers make these decisions every day. Codes are misinterpreted, engineers who are not aware of the strengths or weaknesses of existing structures, historic fabric that is not supporting primary structure but is lost for no good reason, and structural elements once strong, now compromised by years of renovation that are deemed historic and safe. To be clear, this is not to seek a regulatory system that grinds progress to a halt. I do not want Ezra Klein coming after me. Most often, renovations are small and a full upgrade not required, or an owner is making significant changes that remove all these systems and an upgrade is obvious. Other times, an owner will be told by their engineer that they could upgrade voluntarily, but most do not. Every once in a while, an owner will choose to upgrade on their own and spend money to do work to ensure the survival of the historic systems. We were involved in the coating of the entire inside face of the Guggenheim Museum, but that project was instigated to prevent the cracks on the outside of the building, not to upgrade seismically. At the end of the day, the continuity of the carbon fiber lent a better seismic frame to the Guggenheim, but the owner did not choose it for that reason. All of this, similar to the infinite number of building projects going on in this city every day, would occur without the work of this proposed commission being engaged. But about those marble stairs or library stack system are a singular example of a well-built and well-maintained early steel frame or an archaic floor system with more strength than assumed. Technology keeps advancing as these systems age. And what if the two converge, technology and history, in specific locations and moments to ensure that engineers in the future could learn from these past assemblies and truly evolve rather than just advance blindly into the future? What if the energy and joy that Guy and I find in our ongoing debates about our role, the industry, and life were the type of energy to animate and propel these conversations? In the end, regardless of what form this all might take, I feel strongly that decisions about significant work in and around these archaic systems and their ability to participate or not should not always be made by one person, one firm, or one building official, but rather through deliberation, discourse, and collaboration. Yes, buildings are supremely complicated, and there are times that a commission like this could cause bad trouble rather than good trouble, but more often, it is our belief that there is a spirit within these buildings that will tell a clear, elegant, and straightforward story if we allow it to.
Thanks, Nat. That was really serendipitous interlocking, I think, with my topic, because what it occurs to me is that what we're really talking about is aspects of the landmarks law that are still kind of in flux or open to interpretation. I hesitate to call them voids because I'm not sure that I want them corrected, or that correcting them wouldn't make them worse. But you point to the structural engineering not being part of the landmarks law, and I think that there are two other things that are kind of the threads through what I'm going to talk about. One is that the landmarks law really only looks mostly at the exterior of the building. There are interior landmarks, but the idea of interpreting architecture as being two distinct things, the exterior and the interior, well, that's not how architects think about their buildings, and it's not how we experience them, right? We walk through the door, we don't think we've entered a different dimension. Good architecture is about the continuity of experience between the city or the countryside, the landscape, the exterior of the building, the threshold, and then everything that happens inside. So that's one thing. And the other that the landmarks law doesn't deal with at all is use. You can designate a historic district and make sure that the changes, the visual changes to the urban fabric in, say, the West Village are slow and governed, and that the neighborhood remains looking pretty much the same, but you can't govern how people use it, or whether those businesses remain the same, or what kinds of people live there. So the whole argument, for instance, about whether historic preservation is a gentrifying force or a force for preservation of social fabric, or anything having to do with, neighborhood character, these are conversations at cross purposes, because really that's not what the landmarks law does or can do. So with those two things in mind, I just want to back up a little bit, because I come to this, it feels a little funny to go to be speaking after a structural engineer who's, responsible for actually making the building stand up, because I'm not an architect or an engineer or an academic. I'm not a scholar. I'm a writer. And so my interpretation of architecture is through a sort of layman's, experiential quality. What does a building feel like? How does it work in the city? How does it look like? How does it look? But also just, what is the experience of a building over time? And what I want to talk about today is time, which is not really something that we think of as an inherent quality of architecture, but of course it is. And to understand where I'm coming from, I think it helps to scroll back both a really long time, but also just to my childhood, because I grew up in Rome and learned about architecture mostly from just like getting on my bike and riding around the city, something I still do 40 years later, more than 40 years later. But it's just passing things that I didn't understand and just taking a look at them and returning to them over and over again. And this is the Theater of Marcellus in Rome. But the interesting thing to me about it is that it has a 16th century palazzo basically plonked into and on top of it. And what's interesting to me about it is, and has really conditioned my approach, I think, to looking at architecture, is first of all the irreverence, right? This is an ancient Roman building that when you think of things through the lens of the landmarks law, or to our idea of landmark stuff, you don't touch it, or you touch it with a very great deal of reverence and distance. And so the idea of just saying, oh, well, here's kind of an interesting structure, let's like build some housing on top of it. That's not generally the way we think of it, but it was very natural. It has always been very natural in Rome. And I think, so you see a bunch of arches holding each other up in a circle, defining a theater in this case, or a stadium in the case of the Colosseum. And, for many centuries, people felt very free simply plundering it for stone to build other buildings, or adding stuff to it to keep it standing up, or to change the use. And that's really my point. Here's a theater that becomes a residential building, really an original mixed use building. I think what this building says to me, that when I think about like how it prepared me to look at architecture professionally, what it says is that a good building especially, has a kind of moral right to exist. And Rome and New York are very different that way, because I think here we tend to think that a building has to earn its right to exist. So the starting point is different, and it leads in very different directions that kind of converge a little bit. So in Rome, there's 2,000 years of that kind of irreverence, which is whatever you've got, you use it however you can, without worrying too much about authenticity, without worrying too much about whether you're improving or turning it into a slum. If it's there, you use it. You move into it, you build on top of it, you build up close to it, you tear it down, and so on. It's this kind of constant churn of not just of uses and people and culture, but of materials themselves. And that's partly because the materials were so durable, right? Stone, it's not going anywhere. But after the war, after World War II, effectively that idea disappeared. And what you got was an urban fabric that is time stopped. Now, Rome itself has continued to change, but the fabric looks pretty much the way it did when the bomb stopped falling in 1945. And that's because basically the attitude, that irreverence went away, and Rome, central Rome we're talking about, became kind of a fixed zone where really change basically could not happen at all, or very, very incrementally. The regulatory barriers became basically almost insuperable. In New York, where the history was first of a city built of wood, essentially disposable materials, gradually becoming more permanent, but still the idea that every generation was really going to start again, not because the old buildings were unusable, but simply because they were obsolete from a point of view of architectural fashion, or because of the economics of the time, or because the neighborhood was developing. I live on the Upper West Side, and that's the history of, you know, farmhouses being built. 20 years later, they come down. Row houses go up. 20 years later, they come down. Mansions go up along Riverside Drive. 20 years later, they come down, and then taller buildings go up. And then, as in a little bit as in Rome, then evolution stops for a while. But in New York, that constant architectural churn led to, after the development of the passing of the landmarks law, to a kind of overlap of this city that is never stops, that is constantly evolving, coexisting with a city of historic districts in which everything moves much more slowly. So what I want to talk about in the rest of the time is this kind of friction between the idea of things changing and the idea of things staying the same. And to me, one recent example of that kind of, you know, Roman approach of reuse, we call it adaptive reuse. To me, it's just like, that's a sort of abstract term for that idea of taking an old building and instead of tearing it down, using what's there to create something different, but also to change how it works, to change what we use it for. So this is the St. John terminal, which went up in the 1930s as one of these like big industrial, not particularly graceful, sturdy buildings that was meant to function at a time when New York was still at the end of its chapter, when it was primarily organized economically and socially around moving stuff. There's a great, I should have brought this in, but to me, there's a great Bernice Abbott photograph of Fulton Fish Market in the 1930s. And it's kind of divided horizontally. In the foreground and in the lower part of the photograph is a couple of guys in high boots on the docks, and some ships like on the piers, and there's water on the piers. You can practically smell the fish, right? It's like this very working class New York based on the economics, which goes back to the founding of New York, of bringing stuff in from one part of the world, moving it around, packaging and sending it out off someplace else. And it requires muscle and space and the infrastructure of a certain brawny infrastructure. On the upper part of the photograph are the high rises of the financial district, and Southern Pine is, sort of stands out there. And to me, that's a picture of the future of New York of 1930. That is, as New York is evolving into a place where instead of moving stuff around, it moves money around, money and paper and ideas. And that's really sort of a picture of New York simultaneously in two different centuries, really. So that's the kind of like turning point as New York evolves. And it's a miraculous moment because it's exactly what allowed New York, after the deindustrialization, that is after the invention of containerization, after the war, when all of that industry started to disappear, it allowed the city to continue to reinvent itself. It had already started. And that meant that as traumatic as deindustrialization was, and as tough as, say, the 1970s were, New York still had decades of experience behind it of transferring itself into to use an anachronistic term for that period, a city of the creative class. So this to me is a picture that's kind of an update on that Berenice Abbott program, which is sort of the remnants of that structure, which stayed vacant, essentially unused for decades because it really had no place in the modern economy. And then Google bought it as the base for its own building, which is one of several in New York. And did it in such a way so that you remember what it was, right? It didn't transform it. It added onto it, much the same way the 16th century palace was added onto the Theater of Marcellus, for a completely different population, right? What you're seeing here is the end of these train platforms, right? That came in, this elevated train line that came in and allowed, this is the platform, this is the rails, and they just like sliced off this end of the building and put the logo on top of it and the building on top of that. But you can still see the kind of raw concrete, the raw structure, and perceive what it was for. And this is just another view. You can see the overlay of solar panels, but also the landscaping on the upper floor, but also the way that building integrates into the combination of old masonry, the sort of heterogeneity of the urban fabric in that part of the city. So we have this, the 19th and 20th centuries left us with this huge inventory of obsolete buildings that have outlived what they were for, or that endure in some kind of vestigial way. This is the Battery Maritime building right near here, which still kind of serves as a ferry terminal, but is getting a fraction of the traffic that it was built for. It was built for a maritime city, and then New York effectively stopped interacting with its waterways in the same way. But it endured, it didn't get demolished, in large part because it's a really good building, because it's really beautiful and people loved it. And I think this is one of those things about preservation that is so important, which is when you ask yourself, what are the qualities that help the building endure? One of them is just a sense of communal participation, in the sense that it would be a shame to get rid of it. And it's one of these ineffable things, but the idea that the aesthetic qualities, that beauty should matter so much, that that's what helps a building endure and stand up as much as its sort of ability to withstand an earthquake. It's sort of at the heart of the landmarks law. And I just want to give you another example of the way we have learned in so many ways, and when I say we, I mean them, the people who really know what they're doing, to take buildings that were devalued because they didn't serve their purpose anymore, and just lay fallow and can be revived. This is an interesting example. This is the Malthouse is a kind of latter-day term for what was essentially an abandoned brewery in Manhattan Valley. This is Amsterdam Avenue at 122nd Street. And the developer there and Gluckplus spent many years taking a whole bunch of buildings, assembling them into what was essentially thought of as a kind of incipient uptown office district and research triangle. Here, there's across the street, there's a new building that was designed as a biotech research building. It's walking distance to Columbia and to their Manhattanville campus with all of the science research. So it seemed like a good bet. Then COVID happened, and the market for offices collapsed, and certainly the market for sort of marginal office districts collapsed. And so this is now a building that is looking for a new use, or it's a set of buildings that are looking for a new use. But what I find interesting about it is, again, the sort of what I think of as the Theodore Marcellus sort of syndrome, which is taking something that is inherently heterogeneous and making it more so. Taking something that evolved over time and that was abandoned and that still has a kind of presence, and extending that presence into the present. And this is, I think, a good example. This is the courtyard kind of in the back of these buildings, and you can see how it was always a mishmash of different styles, different construction techniques, different moments, and the way those can be unified, not just by an addition on top, but also the landscaping at the ground level to create passages between different levels. Now, I want to contrast that with a lot of the way we think of the modern city developing in recent decades, which is the specificity, the tightness of the engineering, the efficiency that the whole system of supply chain, of analysis, of design, and especially of lending and financing all funnels into. So, these are recent buildings, one Vanderbilt and some of the super talls along 57th Street. The tallest one you see there is Shops 111 West 57th. And of course, in some ways they're similar. They're super tall, glass clad, curtain wall buildings. But because they have different functions, they're conceived completely differently and have completely different presences on the skyline and especially on the street. And that makes it difficult to conceive of how they can evolve as their uses change. So we have all of these massive masonry buildings that are kind of that we've learned to adapt. What we haven't learned to do really is to create a kind of urban fabric with that idea in mind, because this building, which is sort of designed from the trading floor up, that's sort of like you have to have these large span fat floors with large distances between the windows and the elevator core, tapering as you go up. And then on the other hand, the exact opposite, which is, each floor is an apartment. And so the distance between the window, every bedroom has to have a window. So the distance, but they're selling the view. So the distance between the skin and the darkest part of the apartment is basically, almost nil. Now, one of the things that we've been doing recently is learning more about how to take modern buildings, which were designed with very specific purposes some decades ago, and convert those into apartments. And that's a major sort of generational project, I think, because we have a large surplus of office space and a shortage of living. So that's a process that's ongoing. And what's interesting to me about this is this was manufactured as Hanover, a building that was designed as a first data center. It was, a computer center. So it didn't have any windows because it was full of machines, and really didn't need that kind of exposure. And this is the view from the New York Magazine offices of this under construction. The first thing we did was create a lot of openings, take down a lot of the facade in order to create, change the address and create a residential building that will eventually look something like this. The idea of being able to change use is especially important in our era, I think, because of the environmental argument for preservation that I've alluded to, the idea of embodied carbon, right? Architects and engineers have gotten quite good at minimizing the operational carbon of a building, really getting to where, the newest technologies are making minimal demands on energy, but the energy that goes into creating the building in the first place is something that's the next frontier. And so the more you bake in a use that and a specificity and a precision that really doesn't have the flexibility that we're going to need in the coming decades, the more environmental harm you are doing to the future. And I think one good example is this is the parking structure at Yankee Stadium that if you ever need parking, there's plenty of spaces because nobody ever parks there because everybody takes the train to Yankee Stadium. But the owners were obliged with the city deal to put up parking that they knew perfectly well nobody was going to need. And it's created a massive financial sinkhole. And contrast that with the approach of this building, which in the, relatively early in our car culture was created as a sort of vertical, the technology was developed as a way of parking cars vertically and maneuvering them vertically. And it may not have been very successful financially in the short term. It didn't last that long. But the marvel of it was how easily it was converted to housing. And so that building is still standing, and that's at the corner of Columbus Avenue and 61st Street. And it's a combination. It's an apartment building and also part of Fordham University. And this is just kind of an extra because I think what it shows is that you can design a building with very specific needs and that era's attitudes in mind, and after a period of lying fallow, it can find another iteration. This is in Holmdel, New Jersey, and the sort of setup as a research lab for Bell eventually really stopped working. But it has been revived by Alexander Borland and by its new owners as kind of like a place for startups. But it has acquired new celebrity as the location for the TV show Severance. And so that's why I may look familiar to know it from its Bell incarnation. So I think all of this leads me to a sense that one of the ways the idea of preservation can create some friction with the system we have for putting up new construction is to think less in terms of efficiency and more in terms of nimbleness. Now, I mentioned before that efficiency is kind of paramount, right? And it has to be from the get-go. It's the most efficient kind of building project is when everybody's in the room at the same time. And the owner wants to save money. The value, the value engineers want to make sure that all of that money is being wisely spent. The program has to be fit into the smallest amount of square footage. Every square foot, especially in a high value city like New York, every square foot has to justify itself. You can't waste any. We have a whole overlay of environmental efficiency. We don't want to use any more materials than we have to. Don't want to waste any of that. And both operationally and in terms of embodied carbon. And significantly, we have the technology to quantify a lot of that down to a very specific and precise degree. So you can calculate exactly how much steel you need for that kind of building. And then once you know that, why would you add any more? And I think one of the big differences between today's most technologically advanced buildings and the buildings that we've inherited is that the buildings from the 19th century or the early 20th century that we've inherited that Matt was talking about that have endured, but that are difficult to quantify and difficult to bring up to code are in part that way because engineers and builders overcorrected. They didn't really know, they couldn't quantify it exactly, so they over-engineered it. They added more steel, more masonry, more concrete than they might have needed. And we're living off the fumes of that approach because there are things that should have fallen down a long time ago that are still there. And we are finding that it's easier and more efficient to patch them up. But all of that efficiency boils down to a kind of limited tolerance for change. If you start with the idea that buildings should be nimble as well as efficient, then what you do is you start thinking about it in terms of building in a certain level of flexibility. And when I say flexibility, it doesn't just mean that on Thursdays you can have the conference room, for 30 people, but if you open the partition, you can make it for 60 people. That's fine. Or like the Performing Arts Center at the World Trade Center, where all of the seats can move, the stages can move, and there's that kind of flexibility. You can have larger and smaller gatherings. I'm talking about flexibility over time. The idea of being able to adapt a building. Those needles on West 57th Street, how are they going to be adapted when that market, that specific market for that kind of square footage goes away? How are you going to turn them into a kindergarten or into, a workshop of some kind or into a theater? Like you can't even imagine how to do that because they are so specifically designed. So it's a little bit hard to imagine what it would mean to build in that kind of flexibility in contemporary buildings, to imagine a building that can outlive its current use. So I don't have any, exact prescriptions for that. But one thing I think is that to use recyclable materials that age, that can be replaced piecemeal, rather than buildings that are precisely, customized and so tightly engineered that, once a curtain wall fails, you have to replace the whole system. That I think is something we should be looking at, because the marvelous thing about bricks is that they're individual units. And I think that what this building by KPF, one of the great purveyors of glass towers all over the world, ironically has done this brick arch, kind of old-fashioned but quite striking building in the West Village. One of the things that it shows is that kind of modular grid approach, which I think will turn out to allow for a great deal of flexibility. But I think one interesting building that I know only slightly and from a distance is the Bullitt Center in Seattle, because this was from 2013. This was sort of a forward-looking, environmentally aware building. In fact, the whole profile of it is determined by the solar panels on the roof, which become kind of like, a hat on top of the building, and so it becomes part of its profile. But more interesting in a way to me is the way it was conceived, not in terms of the high-tech energy-saving systems, but the way it was conceived for the future. And that is with a structure that was designed to last for 250 years, and I specify that. A sort of 50-year envelope, which will eventually be replaced. And then sort of this 25-year window for the technological aspects that can, the systems that are, the whole thing was designed to be able to swap those out as they age. And the result of that is that the structure is mass timber and the form is modular, and it gives you just a very beautiful interior, which I think, is part of, to get back to that sort of the appeal of beauty, is I think very attractive, speaks, promisingly about its future. And suggests that it's a building that, whether or not it turns out to be successful in this way, I don't know, but it's a building that can start a conversation about thinking about the full life cycle, but also extending the life of a building, which gets us to this, a phrase that Alex Gordon used 50 years ago that a lot of architects invoke, but I think that in the current context means something more definite. The idea of long life, loose fit, low energy, which is that if we're talking about the really long longevity of a building, hundreds of years, and its energy, preserving the energy that's contained in its embodied carbon, the loose fit specifically means to me a building that can outlive its usefulness, its current usefulness, and find another one. But I think it's interesting when you look at the construction of the Bullitt Center that a New York Times article pointed out, with no comparable structures to point to, banks were at a loss for how to value many of the building's central features, included its expected log level. And I think that is a key thing. We just don't know how to quantify, in the same way Nat was talking about, we don't know how to quantify some of these old structures and determine whether, objectively whether they're still safe, except just by the fact that they're still there. Banks look at comps, and if there aren't any, they don't know what to do. But also, neither the bank nor the owner really is incentivized to think about spending more money now in order to have a building that will be there 250 years from now. Because what is the financial point of doing that? We build in an idea of obsolescence simply by all of the superstructure of regulation, of habit, of financing on top of that. And I just want to end with sort of this a reminder that the idea of rebuilding and recycling is an old one. This is the every 20-year rebuilding of a shrine in Japan. Of course, that doesn't change the use, and it's not particularly environmentally sustainable because it's new wood all the time. Although some of the old wood does get recycled, and we've also now incorporated a whole structure of reforestation, which helps. But that idea of using timber as a recyclable material and something that also adds that flexibility because you can take it apart and reassemble it in different ways, I think has given us a whole new kind of architecture using old technology or new versions of old materials. And that brings me to this project that we did, and I spoke about at a different Skyscraper Museum event, which is the idea of bringing mass timber to New York in a big way. This is a speculative SOM design that they did for this New York Magazine project. This building obviously doesn't exist. It's a soccer stadium on the Queens waterfront in Long Island City. It's a mass timber braid covered with ETFE. And this gives you an idea of how that structure is made. And to me, this is eloquent of that idea of both modularity and recyclable, renewable materials. Because among other things, you can imagine this outliving the need. I mean, it hasn't even been built yet, and it won't. But if it were, you can imagine it sort of like enclosing a whole other set of uses besides a sports stadium. It can become any number of things, including housing. And I just want to end with one other SOM building, because I think, when I was looking for examples of something that seemed like an effective model, or at least an example of a building that allows for a different kind of future. This is a high-tech building specifically designed for one corporate client, for Disney, by SOM. And yet, if you look at it and you take away that knowledge, I think you can imagine it becoming something else. And some of that is built in simply to the attractiveness of the terracotta elements on the facade, the landscaping on the within it. So I don't mean to suggest that this is like a model, everybody should be doing this. But I think what I'm trying to get at is a mindset that gets past all of those objections and habits and rules about how to build, and find a way to incorporate that idea of the future. There is a building that outlives its usefulness, but that isn't necessarily doomed just for that reason. Thank you.
Thank you very much for really a provocative set of ideas. I want to let the audience, who is, I can see a professional and very intelligent audience here, ask questions. But I want to kind of add to my observation of what you're talking about is more historic preservation issues than landmark issues, right? Landmarks law issues, because what you were describing, I'm sure someone from the Landmarks Preservation Commission especially the lawyers would say, well, that's not what the law says. That's not what the enabling legislation says. You know, we can't do it this way because the idea of the constitutionality of the law is something which is, you know, forgotten, I think, in most of the discussion as it kind of plays out. But you're talking about the future of the city and the history of the city. And so why don't you respond to Nat, maybe to Justin a little bit, and then I will get out of the way and you can call on the audience to ask questions.
Yeah, I mean, it was great. And we did not speak before this talk, so it was nice to overlap in that way on a lot of this. I think what I was trying to grab at or and I was not there, the law is almost precisely as old as I am, but so I wasn't there when they were formulating it, but I was trying to sort of grasp at what that conversation must have been at that time. And whatever the law ended up being, the idea that people felt this near loss or were trying to understand how to preserve parks without, you know, freezing in time, and I'm sure the debates were incredibly boisterous about that. Should we freeze in time? Should we not? How do we write the law? How do we make sure and so I'm just sitting here right now looking at a lot of these projects we're involved in, and Justin did a very nice job from my office. We were on a lot of those projects. And recognizing that it's of a time now where these buildings are getting older and older and older. So it's not forever that they just are perfect and awesome. And how do we think about this? And I know on the Guggenheim, because it was such a major project, we actually had a group of peer engineers come in at one point to peer review our idea. We self did that. And I just think that there's too much, I mean, it sort of goes to the towers in a way, there's too much aggression and competition and everything else in the engineering community to sort of always say, no, you hired us, we have the right answer. Instead of, there are moments for discussion and so on. And I wanted to try to grasp at that we all live among this city. And there's a role there to have that discussion about how that works and when a factory is right, when it isn't, and so on and so forth. I mean, and I would just respond. I loved what Justin said, and I was saying before the talk, I've often said, I was on a panel about 10 years ago about future-proofing buildings, and there was every other panellee was talking about cabling and all this technical advances to make the building future-proof. And I lectured on a single factory that just sort of said, like, it was here in 1880, it's still here, and it seemed pretty future-proof. So I do appreciate you highlighting.
I mean, I think the law is an expression. I mean, obviously, it speaks to the limitation within which it's written, the constitutional limitation, the practical ones. But I think it's also an expression of an attitude of the time and a fear of the time that the historical fabric of New York and of other cities, because they were so concerned with modernity, was simply going to disappear. That friction or that tension between sort of New York constantly reinventing itself and being nostalgic for its past is, I think, something that all New Yorkers live with every day. When my son was 5 years old, he went to the playground that he had been going to his entire life for 3 years, and they had changed the playground equipment, and he was bereft. He was like, his city had just disappeared, and they had changed the use and the demographic group because it was now for I forget whether it was younger kids or older kids, but not for his age group. And it just struck me as like the quintessential New York experience. You know, the city's constantly changing, but we're also so attached. You know, I've observed that people start to feel like New York, that they are losing their New York after they've been here 2 weeks. Like all of a sudden, it's like all that stuff that you knew about 2 weeks ago, it's all disappearing. So I think that's a really fundamental aspect of it. And the law was meant to address that in a global way. But it obviously has carve-outs that mean that we, I think, collectively have to address them in a different way, not necessarily a legal way. You know, I haven't really thought about whether I advocate changing the law but I think, you know, the law allows for a lot of loss, which is probably appropriate, but any given loss is keenly felt. It also allows for a lot of innovation and a lot of juxtaposition, which I think is a great thing. So it has a certain amount of flexibility built into it. But I think that what I was trying to get at was thinking not so much about preserving the past, but about imagining how you create an ongoing development of the urban fabric, how you create new buildings that are worthy of preservation in the future. So I'm trying to, like, you're trying to imagine what that conversation was like 50 years ago, 60 years ago. And I'm trying to imagine the conversation 60 years from now of like, do we preserve that building that went up in 2024 or can we demolish it? And I think one goal that is not really very often articulated is we should be creating buildings that demand that kind of preservation in the future.
Why don't you call on people?
Questions, comments?
Somebody put a hand up. Great guess. Yes.
I want to go to the one of the illustrations you showed as a possible candidate for structural landmarking, and that is this book system, which is kind of outrageous. The whole structural invention of bookshelves that hold up books, but then hold up themselves, that hold up the floors adjacent to them. And from what I've looked at some illustrations, and perhaps the one you showed, they sometimes hold up the floor or the roof above. So it's like a giant structural column.
Yeah.
It seems like actually, if you look at the drawings for the New York Public Library, the Rose Reading Room is being held up by book stacks.
That's right.
Is that true?
That's as far as I remember. Yes, I'm pretty sure.
Empty
Partner may know.
empty books.
Empty books.
So when Foster was going to take all the book stacks
There
out,
was a lot of
big
discussion.
structural
Yeah.
problem.
Yes.
So should that be saved? I mean, should that be memorialized as a remarkable structural system that, I guess you don't spray fireproof it, you don't bring in sprinkler systems because they're books, but is that a noble revolutionary idea that's worth memorializing?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and just, it's interesting. It's what is that churn and what does it become? Like we want to believe, okay, it'll always be filled with books, but let's say an owner owns it and says, well, I have no, I'm not going to do this. Does it become a data storage area or some other device that's less occupied? So, I mean, a lot of engineers look at, I hate to be callous, but it's, our laws are around statistics. How likely is it, are you going to be in a building when it collapses? Can you get out within 2 hours? Our fire laws are about that. It's not about that it'll never burn. And so do you reinvent it as another space? That's really the question. I'm not sure something that unique you could say, like, no one can ever touch this. You always have to have books there. But could you, and most of those spaces are in public buildings that are unlikely to just be converted, but we never know. So could you allow for other uses? We very often get hired, which is a wonderful thing to say, we don't want to put books in there. What else can we put in there? We'd like to try to save it, but it's not mandated. So it's a question.
But I think that's a really interesting example because that couldn't be brought up to not just code, but contemporary library standards. Right? You couldn't fit in the equipment needed to protect those volumes. And so when that project disappeared, when that idea of changing the structure, putting in new steel, emptying that out, turning it into a lending library, when that went away, so did the books. And my understanding is those stacks are now empty and basically always will.
Holding up the floor.
Yeah. So, and the books have moved.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you have a very large part of a very central building, lots of square footage, and it's completely vacant.
Yeah. And the question is, what would go in there? Take a crowdsource.
What's your feeling on the super talls, which I personally feel that they're sort of pointless and unattractive and probably ultimately unsafe. And you implied that they would be very hard to retrofit or refit. I mean, why are those going up? So,
well, I want to point out a few things. I mean, I do think, look, I was fortunate enough to grow up in the middle of Greenwich Village. I'm a big fan of Jane Jacobs. I think it's often misinterpreted as like frozen in time. And she often talked about the mix of everything. I'm not a fan necessarily of super talls themselves, but there is a lot of great literature and a lot of good studies about the density of cities being a better sustainable environment. And you could argue about what's the right height. So I get it on the super tall, but I'm not, and we're sitting in the Skyscraper Museum, I'm not so I'll be very careful. But no, in New York, I think I am not just a hater of tall buildings. I think it's a question of how do you adjudicate, again, what's appropriate? And right now, they're legal. And frankly, it wasn't structural technology that gave us super talls, it was elevator technology that ultimately drove structural technology.
And finance.
And finance, yeah,
I
yeah,
mean,
and laundering
Carol-
money, by the way, and laundering money, but that's a whole separate story.
Did an exhibition on super talls, and as a historian, my view of them, rather than as a architectural critic and, expressing my own opinion, and I have given, I don't know, 4 conference papers on this very subject, as well as doing an exhibition, is that I predict that 30 years from now or 50 years from now, some of those will be designated New York City landmarks, because what they are the Manhattan Island is the Galapagos Islands. These are our not vernacular, these are our special species that evolved that can be found nowhere else. And that makes them eligible for landmarks protection.
I would be honest, it's probably one of the first structural engineering landmark building might occur. No, because the technology is there in a way that I think is.
But they could exist nowhere else, and they don't. Not
The
even
Middle East.
They exist in London.
They don't. Well, London's very. I don't want to hijack this conversation. But we can talk. I have many reasons I can defend, but this is not my program.
So my feeling about them, I agree with about tall buildings and density, but those buildings are not dense.
Yeah, that's right. That's
There are
right.
very few people, even when they're full, which is never, they don't have very many people. But really, for one thing, we're talking about what, 6 buildings? Minimal amount of square footage, not an important part of, their landmarks because they really stand out. But my question is, they exist, I think, because of the flow of capital, because they made sense as a place to put excess money from sources abroad, mostly in Russia, much of it ill-gotten. So it was a combination of our rules about LLCs and the stability of the New York, the desire to invest in this country and have your assets in dollars, the international flow of capital, the stability and sort of constant growth of the New York real estate market, the presence of Central Park, right? Those are the main.
No, but there's one factor which is absolutely unique to New York compared to other financial centers of capital, and that is the transfer of air rights.
Right, and the transfer.
Right, and so they can't exist nowhere else because the market for such high-end properties as security boxes in the sky can only come together with the value of land and the transferability of air rights that allow you to build as of right, which is the most characteristic thing about New York that there is.
So those air rights aren't going away. Those exist and they are part of the 3-dimensional map of the city. A lot of those other things have already gone away or are going away, right? We no longer have, as of a few months ago, that sort of free flow of capital, and especially coming out of Russia and China. Like, we don't know what's happening with that. The real estate market, who knows? So like a lot of those conditions are changing. Germane to this conversation, I think, is given that a lot of those intangibles that produce those social minute sort of micro system intangibles that produce those large buildings. What happens when those go away? When there isn't a market? Do they become, they're incredibly expensive to sustain, to operate, to keep them going, to keep them, luxurious. What happens when that money starts to dry out?
It's funny, the one example I would give that we're involved in, and it's totally, I agree with you, by the way, I don't see it, but the one building that was always pointed to say you can never do anything else with it is the Museum of Art and Design on Columbus Circle, right? Which was, a private home with no windows that was seen as a building that was impossible to ever use, and they turned into a museum. So I have no idea, but one doesn't know. As flying cars come in, maybe they'll dock up at the upper floors and it'll all be fine.
If you want to expand the Skyscraper Museum, that's
zoning could have an impact on how people define what they're going to build or where they can build, or if they were determined to, I need this to be future proof.
It would, that's an interesting question. I don't
Well,
know
I
if
think,
zoning would control them.
I mean, yes, and, okay. First of all, zoning, I think sometimes zoning and landmarks, I'm not saying you're doing this, but I think sometimes zoning and landmarks get confused in terms of, because they're both forms of restriction on what you can build and where. But the processes are completely independent. And so only very rarely does the landmarks really come up if you're going to build in a historic district. And 85% of the construction in New York is as of right, as Carol was saying. So even trying to get this zoning variances is a relatively rare thing. So of course, zoning shapes everything about how land and air is used in New York and in every neighborhood. And it's constantly changing. It's changing sometimes behind the times, incrementally. It's a very blunt tool, for producing desired results. And I think the example of that I would give is that the most recent large-scale zoning change that has happened is Mayor Adams' initiative, the City of Yes, which is about changing zoning regulations at a sort of detail level all over the city in order to produce a large number of new housing units, new apartments, new homes, or houses, and so on. The problem with that is that zoning doesn't dictate anything about what gets built. It simply changes what's allowed, but it's the market that will ultimately produce that. And so that's a million other decisions. Will people do what the zoning suggests? Who knows? So to predict a certain amount of housing coming out of a change like that is a lot of guesswork. So when you're talking about what to preserve and when and how to, that's almost too detailed a desired outcome
Well, I
for,
guess
for the zoning.
I was going more towards new construction and materials that are being used, and to say we'd like for this to be a flexible, whatever you're building, we'd like for it to be flexible and using zoning in that regard.
It's hard. That it's very rarely dictated. The one thing I want to say, which is the tension we're always in the industry, is and I romanticize them all the time. We get to work with them. Part of the struggle is that there are really good intentions with a lot of these modern buildings to make them better energy buildings. The old buildings we often talk about were horrible energy buildings. They survived and are really future-proof because it was the dumbest building in the face of the earth, which was awesome. There were a bunch of bricks. There were a bunch of really big heavy timbers. You put them together and it's a building that lasts 200 years. You cannot do that now. We're doing a lot of the pilot projects in New York in mass timber. It's fantastic. We want to do mass timber. A lot of owners get better purchase price by doing mass timber, so they're interested in it. So that the real estate market will push that. But there's still facades, even brick facades now have many more movable parts to make them more energy efficient. So brick is no longer solid. It's an interior wall and then insulation, waterproofing, clip angles, bricks, and so on. So I just think that really and I overstate it tonight, but I think that some of the most richest dialogue in the industry now is when people get together and say, how do we solve this tension, and not, well, it's obvious. And I think that will constantly be a back and forth.
Yeah, I just want to, I'd say, you have been polite enough not to point this out, but I'd say the weakest aspect of what I was saying, like the thing that I argue with myself about, is that what I was saying, in order to create something that is flexible and long-lived, you essentially have to think about making it less efficient in the near future. And the real question is, do you want to burn more carbon now in order to save more carbon in the future? Is that a wise thing to do? I don't have an answer for that because I don't know how you calculate it. But you could say it might be worth it to burn a little bit more carbon now in order to have a really long-lived building. Because the alternative might be to make something super efficient now that we're going to have to tear down and replace 40 years from now.
Robustness to the class color.
Yeah.
Premise that probably is true.
Yeah.
My question though, now I think for you a little bit is what in your experience, do you find the codes, to what extent are codes helping or have the ability to help promote adaptive reuse or drive development that will value or encourage reuse versus tearing down?
I think they're getting better and better.
And to what extent does that hurt or help, or could it help in the future? Because part of it is dollars and cents. The other equation a little bit is how you have use codes to manipulate the way dollars and cents comes out.
Yeah, no, I think it's getting better and better, and it does evolve. And I think the industry recognizes this more than it did 20 years ago. So 20 years ago, the International Building Code, it came out 40 years ago, but a volume came out. International Building Code comes out every 7 years or something. And it was all through the lens of new construction. And New York City was especially brutal. That was sort of like either it's old and you just keep going, or you design new and we don't know how to deal with the in between. The IEBC, the International Existing Building Code, has now been around for 20 years, and that continues to really try to look more and more nuanced at how to deal with all this. But New York City, the example I always give just very briefly, and I'm in a 15-year battle with the New York City Building Department at this point. So if you do more than a certain amount of work in a brownstone, you have to seismically retrofit that brownstone. I will keep it very simple, which is that to seismically retrofit a building, you have to calculate the mass of the building you're retrofitting, which is all good. Easy to do. We know how to do it. No problem. Brownstones are connected to the other 200 brownstones on the block. You design that frame for your weight, but not your 200 neighbors. And so I've said to the building department, why am I putting a big, huge frame in there? Not because I love my clients and I don't want them to have steel in there, but I'm saying it's nonsensical. It's not going to work. And in some ways, it's more dangerous because the steel frame might not be compatible with the brick. And they say, look, new building, you did a bunch of work, you spent a bunch of money, put a steel frame in there. So we're not quite there, but every generation, every cycle of codes gets better and better.